Welcome to DevOps and Docker Talk. I'm Bret. In this episode, we're learning about the DockerSlim project, which is now called MinToolkit, or just Mint. Kyle Quest created it years ago at a Docker hackathon, and it's become a popular and multifaceted tool for solving specific container problems that Docker doesn't do itself, mainly shrinking images and debugging containers. But there's a lot going on there. Kyle joined me for a 2-hour live stream where we dug into the past, present, and future of Mint with a focus on the new debugging feature set for containers running on Docker Kubernetes and other runtimes. Kyle is an absolute beast at understanding what makes up Linux and containers. So in this episode, we're turning the Linux nerd level up to 11 and digging into some real-world problems that Mint helps solve. This edited version of that show focuses on catching newcomers up with what Mint can do and how it can solve some of the hardest parts of debugging containers with a particular focus on slim and distroless images, which can be some of the hardest to troubleshoot. So please enjoy this episode with Kyle Quest. Hello, I'm Bret. This is Kyle. Hi, Kyle.
Hey, Bret. Hey, everybody. I'm Kyle, or Q, or the DockerSlim guy.
The DockerSlim guy. And we had Slim AI, a company that you founded
2020.
That company has decided to close its doors, but you're still doing DockerSlim, adding new features. So let's back up for a second and talk about, like, you got into DockerSlim, and when did you start that project?
So it was a while ago, and it was because of a hackathon Docker did back then. I had the idea for a while, and I experimented with it. The idea of an application-centric approach, where you're capturing the information about the application, and then you automatically do stuff with that information.
Yeah.
And then during the hackathon, I thought, well, why not use this information to reassemble the containers to make them better, smaller, and more secure? And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and then the rest is history.
Yep.
DockerSlim got started, the project took off, you got a whole bunch of stars on GitHub. It became a useful tool for inspecting and not just looking into containers, but also actually making new images from them. And I'm sure we'll get into some demos later.
And we get into 1 million downloads.
Nice. That's a lot. I mean, we all talk about container images in the billions, but like when you're a small project running an open source, just to get that many downloads, that's pretty impressive. We have been talking about shrinking our images or using smaller images. Alpine gets thrown out a lot, but I feel like we've been talking about this for 6 years plus. It's not a new thing, but there's still, I feel like still a large portion of container users that feel like it's either they don't know how to shrink their images or reduce the image size. They don't know how to get rid of all the CVEs in their images when they use a scanner for the first time, and they kind of freak out. And then they often will think that the only way they can shrink their images down is to switch to a new distro. Like they have to go from Debian to Alpine or something like that in order to make it all work, which is a lot of work.
Or build scratch images,
images. Yeah.
Doable in some cases for some runtimes, Go, for example.
Right.
But trickier for others. But even with Go, actually, there are quite a few gotchas. We can get into those. But yeah, there's more to it. Yeah,
for sure. But what was like DockerSlim's first feature? Like what was the first reason that you sort of created it? Was it actually shrinking the image down, or was it inspecting it, or what was the original focus?
Building minimal container images. That was the use case. And you mentioned that it's not a new concept. People have been talking about that for a while, have been trying to do that for a while, but let's just be honest. It hasn't been widely adopted yet. And there's a number of reasons. One of the reasons is because it sounds easier than it is. It's easier said than done. And it's a part of this list of container best practices where they say, only put the things you need in your container images. But I always wonder, is there anybody who puts junk in their containers intentionally? I don't think anybody does that. And the problem there is that you just don't know what you need. And sometimes you kind of know, but not always, because you need everything. You need to know everything at every layer. And that's a problem. So the theory and reality weren't on the same page. And now we're getting close to the reality. And there are two parts to it. First, you got to be able to build those minimal container images. And now there are different options to do that.
Right.
And that's awesome. And then you also need to be able to use them. So we'll get to that part later on. But creating those minimal container images is tricky. Like I said, you need to know what to put in them. There are always a number of experts who can do it on their own. But it's about the masses adopting the practice. And for the masses, you need the easy button. So now we have a few easy buttons, and DockerSlim is one of them, where I figured, I know the container internals, I can do it, but I don't want to do it. I'm too lazy to do it.
Right.
So is there a way to automate it? And that's how it was created. I wanted to automate that process, even though I could do it. And it worked. I used it for my services. The very first service I used it with was a Node.js microservice. So there's a number of different runtimes and container types where it works better, and other runtimes and application types where you need to do a little more. And that's because of how it was created. I built it to solve my own problems with my own applications, with my own containers. And then eventually it evolved and all of that. But it's not the only way. Using Scratch images is another way to do it. And, with Go, for example, you can do static compilation. But if you need time zone information and the user ID information, et cetera, maybe assets, certificates, now you get into this realm where Scratch images isn't sufficient. Now you need to add other things. And you need to know about those things. Then you graduate to the distroless images, because they have different tiers of distroless images where they provide that additional information that you can leverage, but the time zone information, the directory layout, et cetera. And so there are multiple tiers. And now obviously we also have the Wolfie and Chainguard images, which are awesome. And they're doing an awesome community service, especially now that the images are available in Docker Hub. I think that's going to improve a lot. So there are, different options, but you can still do it the hard way if you want to control everything about the image.
Yeah. And it used to only be the hard way. Like I can remember, it wasn't that long ago that, we had people like using brute force methods where you would export the image out into the file system and then import it back in order to get a single layer and reduce space that way. And then we had all these different ideas around how do we shrink the image. And I think it was like a year and a half ago, I was actually I think it was Civo Navigate down in Florida, and I gave a talk around just a ton of security tools for basically the whole software lifecycle that are, I think, 30 or 40 tools. And I was just throwing everything at the audience and saying like, look at all these things you can do to actually tighten down your supply chain. It's obviously, images is just one little tiny part of this giant framework of everything in the software lifecycle that needs attention. And when I started talking about container images, because that tends to be our deployment object now, it's our golden disk artifact that everybody is using. And
you can use them with the serverless now, with Lambdas and Cloud Run and all of that. So it's not just for, traditional container runtimes.
You mentioned a lot there about the different ways. And I looked at this as sort of a spectrum of, on one end, you have what I would call, so maybe the hardcore hackers or the container enthusiasts that would go and actually change their distro and find the minimal image. Traditionally, we would all just use Alpine for that, which I always like to point out that I'm not always a fan of that. And in fact, that's why I love the Chainguard now.
There's a huge list of problems there, historical problems and current problems. And some of them they addressed, for example, around DNS supporting TCP, which was crazy that they said, no, we're not going to do TCP or DNS.
Yeah, the challenge there was like, you maybe spent your whole career focusing on CentOS or Debian or Ubuntu or something like that. And then to switch to Alpine for containers always felt like we were forcing a distro of something down people's throats as the only way they can run their software safely or securely. And I always felt like that was aggressive and maybe just doesn't fit everyone. And I love that fact. We had a show, by the way, if you're all watching and you're wondering what these Chainguard thing we keep mentioning, we had a whole show a month ago. So after this show, come back to this channel and look for the Chainguard image show where we talk a little bit about, it was like right after the announcement of them moving all their images to Docker Hub, or not moving, but allowing you to pull them from Docker Hub as well as from Chainguard's registry. So that was a great thing that Docker partnered with them on. But I always looked at this as kind of a spectrum of there's those people, And then there's what I saw you doing at Slim AI, which was, let's do this after the fact. Instead of at the beginning where we're recreating a Docker file, let's build what we think we want. And then after the fact, analyze it and pull things out we don't need, whether it's, whether it's automated or maybe it's just something manual. And I thought that both approaches were necessary. Like, I didn't feel like there was one that everybody fits and like, it's not a one size fits all scenario. And we do need those teams that aren't container experts. We need those teams to be able to use some tool that will help them understand their image and help them shrink it without forcing a complete distro change on every single project.
Exactly. And that can be a lot of work because when you're starting a new project, it's easy. When you have an existing project, that's when it gets complicated. Yeah. And maybe you can invest into a refactor, but sometimes it's not possible. And sometimes you don't even control the OS that you get. For example, you're buying a piece of third-party software. They give you RPMs. Right. Now you have to run CentOS. It wasn't your choice. You didn't choose. Right. Your vendor chose for you. So sometimes you don't even control that. And other times you invested so much in the existing setup that it's just too expensive to change. And it's great when you can change, but a lot of times you can't. So if you're pragmatic, you got to be honest that the majority of applications, they will not change, even though over time they will start transitioning to something better and all of that. So I like the old Microsoft approach. You meet the developers where they are. You don't ask people to change. Asking developers to change or people in general is hard. It's a hard sell. It's a lot of friction. So getting the outcomes they want without requiring the change is a great approach to get what you need. Yeah. And there are a lot of use cases where that's better to do. Sure. Is it perfect all the time? Not always. Do you need to do a little extra sometimes? Yes, you do. It's not always the Nginx example where you don't need anything else and all of that. There's always something. It depends. But it's good to have options. And like you said, it's a spectrum. And it depends on your use cases, where you are in terms of your, phase of your product and your application and all of that.
Yeah. All right, let's get into DockerSlim, which I want to point out first. Let's talk a little bit about the name change. So last time we were on the show, it was moving from the name DockerSlim to Slim Toolkit. But it sounds like you're working on getting into the CNCF project list, or you have. I'm not sure if that's complete or not.
It's already there. So here's the journey. It started with DockerSlim because Docker was the only runtime.
Right.
Eventually, much later on, it started expanding its container runtime support. So it wasn't just Docker anymore. So that was one of the reasons for the name change. But when it was time to join CNCF, during the submission process, we got feedback saying that, well, the name needs to change. So I promised to change the name, and they were nice enough not to make it a hard requirement for the admission.
Yeah.
So, but that was a promise that was made, and that's kind of what's happening now. It's transitioning to the new name as promised. And in a way, it's more generic as well, because Min stands for minimal container images. And the CLI name Mint is actually pretty nice because you can mint awesome containers with it. And it's a good name. It's a good name.
Yeah.
So
I like the new name. Yeah. I love the new name. So we're calling it MinToolkit, or Mint for short. And so for the rest of this show, everybody, when we say Mint, we're talking about DockerSlim. And I mean, branding is hard, right? What do we say? Like, the hardest thing in engineering is picking a name, right? So it's a hard thing to do. But I pulled this up on screen because this was, to me, like originally how I knew Mint was. It was building my image. It was doing things inside it. It was allowing me to inspect it or maybe understand it a little bit better. A lot of people are familiar with Dive, and those people that are familiar with Dive, how would you compare like Dive to Mint, like the purposes?
Good question. DockerSlim started as a way to minify containers. And that was super popular but it wasn't the only capability. The next capability that I added later on was X-ray. So X-ray, you can think of that as Dive on steroids in terms of what kind of information it gives you. The only thing that's nicer with Dive is the terminal UI. And terminal UI is something that we experimented with at the last KubeCon EU. There was a session on terminal UI for the project where we try to learn Bubble Tea. And Bubble Tea, if you're using Go, Bubble Tea is probably the most popular terminal UI library to use. So pretty soon, X-ray will be as good as Dive in terms of the user interface. But in terms of the data it gives you, it's, I don't know, I wouldn't say 10 times better, but you get a lot more out of it. Additional insights about the certificates, about, security data in the container image. You can even search for stuff in container images. You can use the X-ray command as a grep for containers. You can say, Mint is actually a grep for containers, and you can look for strings, etc. from command line, which not a lot of people know, but you can do that. So there's a lot more that you can do, but it's missing the terminal UI to make it easier to navigate what's in the container images.
Well, and certainly if you're just looking to walk around, by the way, I want to mention that you are all over YouTube. So for those that are interested in a lot of this stuff, Kyle's got his hands in a lot of things. If you just even go onto YouTube and just search, like I did earlier before the show, Kyle Quest KubeCon, just this year alone, just in the last 2 months, there's 3 different videos on the CNCF channel with your evidently related to you. I mean, your name is in the title of all of them. So you had a lightning talk on there. You're talking about building the tool and adding the new features we're going to get into, the debug features. You've got a sort of a talk around the journey of Slim, the company, and how like the whole world of open source and startups and stuff like that, which is obviously a tale for those that are interested in creating their own open source and maybe someday making money on it. I'm sure that's a very interesting one. You've got a lot of videos, and it all seems to be focused around helping people with containers. Like you are the DockerSlim guy. You're going to have to change all that to the Mint guy.
No, the name is it's still good.
Yeah, it's still a good name.
Other things that DockerSlim can do, and we can actually ask the AI assistant what DockerSlim can do.
I was going to say that you and I at KubeCon, like we started talking about debug, and that was actually, I think maybe that might have been the idea for the origin of this show like 2 months ago, which seems forever ago. And of course, you've added other things. You've even started a new company since then that I didn't even know about. So let's talk about debug for a little bit. So this is like a relatively new thing in Mint?
It is relatively new. The very first time, and there's a talk about the debug command in the project at KubeCon EU. It talks about the history and how it started. It actually started as a hackathon project at KubeCon EU Valencia. And one of the community members decided to do that, and he actually won that mini hackathon. And Dan was awesome, and he was the first person to add this capability for the Docker runtime, and that's how it started. And then it got extended with support for Kubernetes, and then later on for Containerd and Podman, covering pretty much all major runtimes. And this is important because we talked about creating minimal container images, but yeah, that's a good quote. People will not use them if they can debug them.
Yeah.
I heard it all the time. It's like, okay, you create this minimal container image. It doesn't even have a shell. What am I supposed to do with it if it crashes, if I need to debug it? So that was the pushback. And for a number of different reasons, the ability to debug wasn't quite there. For example, with Kubernetes, I didn't have that capability a while back. Now you have ephemeral containers and the ephemeral container-based debugging capabilities, which makes it possible for minimal containers to the adoption it deserves. So we're getting to the point where the tech is where it needs to be in terms of creating minimal container images and using minimal container images.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the kube control ephemeral, that functionality, and our friend Victor Farsik actually has a pretty good video on YouTube about it, sort of not showing off its functionality, but also kind of picking on it, because just like everything else in kube control, it's raw. It's a little complicated. You have to know a bunch of options to get it to work every time. and it doesn't do everything and has some side effects. And so thanks, Victor. I learned a lot from you actually on that without having to actually go test all the scenarios myself. And so we've also seen other companies get into this game, right? Like Docker now has a new debug command for paid plans. That's an important distinction that I think you and I want to point out is they announced at DockerCon last year, like basically adding some Nix functionality into this idea of like, if you have a minimal image, like you mentioned, that you can't even get into it when it's running as a container because it has no shell.
Exactly.
And then even if you could get a shell in there somehow by, you copy one in, or you could sort of hack your way through something, what else are you going to do on there? Like you probably don't have curl, you probably don't have any tools or to do anything in there. So what do you do then? Like, do you have to, I was always a fan of NetShoot and other sort of massive container images, but then you have to sort of become an expert suddenly on how you get that adjacent, how do you share namespaces and PID namespace, all these different concepts that someone they never had to know all of that before containers. It's almost like we saddled them with a new problem of, well, containers are supposed to be great, but now you got to know all this stuff just to be able to do the same debugging you did yesterday. And I've always kind of felt bad about that because when you get someone, back in the day when we were all like telling our friends, hey, you got to try out this Docker thing. It always felt like, well, now that you got it running, and they were always like, well, now what do I do? Because everyone, like me, I did the same mistake early on where I thought it needed to be a full Ubuntu server inside my image, right? I needed all the tools. I needed SSH daemon running. I needed all these things. And we sort of learned all that at the beginning, but I think a lot of us stopped when the complexity went through the roof for how do I debug this when it's minimal. And that's a great, like you're saying, this is a great quote. I just left it on the screen because I thought this was such a great defining the real problem we're talking about with debugging. Because sure, if you're a Linux guru, NsEnter, all these tools you can use, but a lot of us aren't that. In fact, most of the teams I work with are not that.
Exactly. The masses are not container experts, and they should need to be. If the whole point behind Docker is that it simplified your user experience, your developer experience with the low-level Linux kernel constructs, made it approachable and made it available to the masses. And that's kind of the whole point. And now we have these certain gaps where we kind of fall back to this hole where now you need to be an expert on the internals. So that was the whole point behind DockerSlim, creating minimal container images. You shouldn't have to be a container expert. You mentioned squashing layers and all of that. That's too low level. A regular developer shouldn't need to know about that. Same with debugging container images. You use kube-control debug, or you try to do it natively with the Docker runtime where you're attaching to the namespaces. Again, you're kind of going lower level. And again, you need to know a lot more about containers than you should. And that was, again, the idea behind the debug command, where we wanted to get close to the developer experience you have normally using minimal container images. So you have a sidecar that attaches to your target container, but when you are in the container, you want to see the file system of the target. You want to interact with the applications and the binaries that you have in your target container and in your debug container, as if it's one big fat container that you're used to.
Right.
And that was the intent. That was kind of the design, the high level design. And it's a little different from the Docker debugging capability design. They have a nice Nix angle there. And I think the more tool we have in that space, the better it is, because it's about gaining the adoption and momentum there. And I think everybody wins there. So like you mentioned, it is a paid feature. So one of the benefits you get with DockerSlim is that you don't need to pay for it, and you get more runtimes. It's possible that Docker will add support for other runtimes as well, but who knows? It's a free open source alternative, and it's always good to have those options. And obviously you can do a lot more with the tool, but that's one of the fundamental capabilities complementary to the initial minification capability, because you need to have a sane way to debug your images. And this is what it's about. But there are other commands that are available. And like I said, we'll ask AI what that is.
All right. Well, I think we've been talking about this a lot, and I actually spent only a few minutes playing with the debug command before this show. So I am selfishly here to see some demos and learn some things and how I can use Mint, which I did download to my computer. While we're getting the demo ready, I want to throw out a couple of things if others are listening, because this is also going to end up in a podcast form. If people are listening, there's basically Kyle has partnered with a couple of other also great people at the last KubeCon. So in the show notes, there will be a link to basically the talk from KubeCon called Building a Tool to Debug Minimal Container Images, and on Kubernetes, Docker, and Containerd. So it's sort of becoming this idea around a universal debugging tool. This is a single binary you can download on your machine, right? Like this, or maybe there's two binaries, I think.
There are two binaries. There's an archive with two binaries, the main app and the sensor. You don't need the sensor if you're just debugging. You need the sensor when you need to minify. So you can use only the main app, and that's pretty much it. And that's Mint. There are a couple of symlinks for the old names, DockerSlim and Slim, but you don't need them either.
Yeah, and I want to point out some things. A lot of this, I'm guessing, will change over time. But if you're looking into all this stuff now, the DockerSlim website and the Slim Toolkit GitHub repo still exist, right? So there's
Yep.
It seems like you're kind of dancing between two different repos that have the same Slim/Mint functionality.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time and cycles. There's more stuff to take care of, to consolidate and resolve a whole bunch of questions. And if you look at the Mint repo, some of the images aren't there. Some of the images still have the old names. So it takes time.
There's certainly a lot of logistics. Not only are you rebranding all the marketing and all the screenshots, all the videos, but you've also got to rebuild things, change the names of binaries and build tools. And I noticed, because I had actually, I think it was Slim Toolkit or DockerSlim, one of the two installed through Homebrew on my Mac. And I wanted to basically move to Mint. So I don't know if I did the right thing, but I removed it. I removed the Homebrew app from my computer, and then I just downloaded the two binaries from here and followed your instructions, basically untarred them and moved them over to my user local bin directory. So I'm sure that in the future there will be all the things will be migrated and everything will be transparent and everyone will be on the new stuff. But we're in the middle of this, so I want to just let people know that they might end up in the wrong place. And so to look for the github.com/mint or MinToolkit. I have to say it right. github.com/MinToolkit. You can just go there. It's an organization you set up. And that's going to be in the CNCF project that you're now working on. That's going to be what everybody's calling it is MinToolkit. So look for that.
All
right, let's do some demos.
Okay, so here's one of my screens. There's an assistant app right now for MinToolkit that helps you. It's not public yet. So this is an exclusive demo. But the intent is to make it available, and I'm still trying to figure out if it should be a web interface there just for the assistant part, because then there's also a command part and etc. But we'll see a few things here. So I'll ask the assistant to list all available commands. It's a little slow. It's not doing streaming intentionally to save, not on cost, but to save on the requests, because I ended up hitting rate limits with OpenAI. So I wanted to avoid that. That's one of the reasons. Okay, we got a response. So let's see. We have a whole bunch of different commands. Debug is one of them. X-ray. There's also lint. This is kind of like a traditional lint. And the intent there is to make it work with container images as well. So you lint container images, not just Docker files, because that's what you usually normally get, linting Docker files. Obviously, the build command or also Slim command. There's a number of registry commands. People probably don't know. You can pull, push, create indexes. There's a profile command to get runtime information. You can even run container images. You can merge images as well if you want to. It works nicely with the build command or Slim command when you minify your image with different profiles and you want to put them together. That's a way to do it. There's kind of just basic image information commands and also basic vulnerability related information. Right now it's for looking up EPSS scores for vulnerabilities, but there'll be more. And then a few other things, including this app-bomb command that gives you the bill of material for the executable that you have. And I think every application should have that. It should be able to produce its bill of material. So hopefully we're starting a trend there. So we know about the commands.
By the way, I should tell people in case if they're watching the demo, you're using the this is like an alpha feature. This is like pre-alpha AI feature that you're interacting with. So you can type these commands normally, but we're sort of just playing around with the AI part.
Yeah.
I was going to say real quick, do all these commands work across because this isn't actually running containers on itself, right? It has to have a container runtime and connect to that. So it originally would require Docker, but do all these commands actually work against like a Kubernetes pod, or what is that like? What are my requirements here for running this?
That's a good question. Depending on the command, the support for the container runtimes is different. For the build command or the Slim command, the Docker and Kubernetes runtimes are supported. The containerd and Podman runtimes are not supported yet. And Podman has been the most requested feature from that perspective. Yeah, because a lot of people use the Red Hat tools, and especially in the government, or those who need to deal with FedRAMP. You know, one of the people who asked about the Podman and builder support was from the Air Force. So there is an audience there, and it's pretty popular. And when it comes to the debug command, that's when you have all four runtimes: Docker, Kubernetes, Podman, and containerd. So that's a good question to ask. So,
all right, enough questions for me. Sorry.
What container runtimes are supported by the debug command? That's the question I ask the assistant. It's going to be a couple of seconds to look it up, and it will give us the response. Okay, so it answered the question. Okay. So there, it gives you the information about supported runtimes.
So it's kind of like I can avoid reading the manual. Like I can avoid reading through the docs. I can just ask.
For example, how to use MinToolkit to debug Podman containers. And it's going to give me an overview. And it's pretty decent, actually, because with Podman, you need to make sure that Podman is running. Mint doesn't automatically start Podman for you. And there is a set of instructions for it in the README, but it's nice to ask specific questions and then get answers there. And then you just follow that. And it's pretty decent. So right there, it gives you a set of instructions. It says first start the Podman service, and it gives you the snapshot if you're on Linux, and on Macs, for example. If you use Podman desktop, you don't need to do that. On Linux, you would run this command, and then it gives you a sample how to connect to that runtime. There is a flag to connect to the endpoint, Podman endpoint. And then one more question I'll ask. I'll ask it to explain the run as target shell flag. And run as target shell flag is one of those UX enhancements you get with Mint debugging. When you connect to the target and it feels like you are in that target container image, as opposed to the debug image, because that's what you usually get. When you use kube control debug, you end up in your debug image environment as opposed to the target image environment. And it gives...
Right, so target in the context there, I actually wasn't sure about that. The word target implies the target container that I'm trying to troubleshoot. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is an example of this AI assistant that they'll be able to answer questions and later on run commands for you. But that was built based on the feedback I got, because people struggle to find information sometimes, and it's nice to be able to ask that information. And what it is, it's a pretty basic RAG using the assistant API in OpenAI. They have V2 that's been enhanced, and it's vector store. It has a built-in vector store, and it does a better job now. Still doesn't support a lot of file types, but you can always default to the text files. For example, it supports C files, it supports JavaScript files, C# files, but not Go files, which is kind of funny. So yeah, it's a basic RAG using OpenAI Assistant with custom data from Discord, from issues, from the source code, and all of that. So it's able to answer the questions that you ask there.
Nice.
So let's see. Let's start with the most low-level runtime, and that's the containerd runtime. I have a VM, a Vagrant VM running with a containerd and nerd control. And if you're using containerd directly, you probably know what nerd control is. It's kind of like a low-level equivalent of the Docker CLI. And you get mostly the same behavior. There are a few minor differences. But here, I'm going to run a minified container images that I built.
Yeah, so you're starting in the example target container, right? And it's got Nginx and nothing else in it, I assume, because it's called Nginx Slim.
Yeah, pretty much. So the container is running, and it's a containerd image. And now the VM is not perfectly set up, so I need to use sudo. And I'm going to use the interactive prompt mode. And that's been a very nice enhancement. And I didn't think it was that great and that useful. But then I got feedback from users saying that it was a game changer, but the interactive CLI prompt made it easier to configure different parameters because you also have autocompletes for some of them, especially container names, etc. And that's pretty convenient. And so let's pick the debug command, and then we'll use the containerd runtime and run. So run as target shell is one of the parameters, but it's on by default. So I'm not going to set it anyways. I'll need to configure the target. And right there, I have autocomplete. It's so much nicer to have that as opposed to looking for the name or the image ID.
Tabbing a bunch of times, or we're trying to configure ZSH auto-completion, which I get questions a lot. You would be surprised how many students are always wanting autocomplete. They see autocomplete for Docker and kubectl in my demos, and then they're like, I gotta have all of that, and they don't realize the difference between ZSH and Bash, and like just all the little subtle nuances that nobody should have to care about in shells. So that I'm actually warming up to it too, because I traditionally didn't use it either with DockerSlim back in the day. But now seeing it in Mint, it makes me kind of wish I had that with a lot of my tools like Docker and kubectl.
Exactly. So right there, if I look for Nginx, it'll find Nginx. I can access Nginx directly, but that's not what you get by default. And we'll do a default kind of example, but that's not why you're getting it. And if you look at the PS output, there's this funny looking shell command that's doing something. So if we look under the hood and we list the content of the file system, there's a number of hidden directories. So if we look at them, you'll see that they are symlinks. They're symlinks to the binary directories from my debug image. So it says /proc, /31, /root, etc., etc. So normally you access the file system from different environment for the target image through the proc file system going to proc1. And here it's the opposite, where it's accessing the files from the debug image using the proc file system. And as opposed to having to do it explicitly and manually, it sets up a symlink for different bin directories, and it makes them accessible. And then it does a change root. So your file system looks like you're connected to the target image. And there are a few gotchas in terms of when you can change root. And we'll talk about that, especially with the Chainguard images, but that's kind of the general idea. So for me as a developer, it looks very similar to having a fat container with the tools and the shell and all of that. I can do things directly. My UX is the same. And that's kind of the high level design goal for the debug command there.
Yeah. So let me recap real quick. So that what we're talking about is you ran a simple debug command. It was, less than 100 characters, and you were able to get into a running container on one of multiple choices of runtimes. And in this case, you use containerd. And you had your own debug, or I guess it defaulted to a certain debug image. I guess we'll talk about that in a minute. And gave you a shell inside a shellless container with the tools that came with your debug image. Because for people that don't know about NetShoot and some of the other traditional, what we would call debug images, that's kind of the concept you've taken to the next level, I feel like, with this tool, which is you have now multiple choices, and you don't have to, you can, but you don't have, I think you can, but you don't have to bring your own, which was always a challenge with my students, because they would ask about debugging, and then we'd have to explain all the stuff we just did. And then I would have to say, well, now you got to go find an image to use, because you need you're going to need some things. You're probably going to want some tools. And where do you find those tools? Well, you might just be your own Linux expert and you build your own. And that's when the students go off on a complete tangent. And I feel like it's one of these scenarios where like all they wanted to do was be able to cat a file in a directory or look at the process list or something like that. But now they're down this rabbit hole of like, what is NetShoot? Who's Nikolai? Like, what am I looking at this thing for? Yeah. So it's cool that you kind of build this stuff in, so you don't have to know all of that starting out.
So that's a good point. And there's a built-in list of different debug images. NetShoot is one of them, by the way. And there's more that can be done there, especially with the AI assistant, because you can say, hey, I need to be able to do that kind of debugging. So it would pick the right debug image ultimately. It's not doing this right now, but that would be a great use case where, again, you wouldn't even need to know the name of the debug image to pick. You just share your intent and it'll be selected automatically, or it would be built on the fly. There are interesting ways to build debug container images on the fly using nixery.dev, where you can say, hey, I want an image and with those packages in them. And so there's an opportunity to do that dynamically. So that would be uber cool.
Yeah, I didn't actually know about Nixery because I have yet to really fully dive into the Nix community, even though everyone's like, do Nix videos, add Nix to your courses, have Nix on the show. Like everybody wants to know all the stuff, but Nixery,
this is a
container
subset.
Images.
Yeah, so it's not, you don't have to get into Nix completely. It's just a way to dynamically create images with the stuff that you need. And it's a perfect match for the debug container image use cases, because the tools you might need might be different based on the kind of debugging scenario that you need to deal with. So let's try debugging a Podman image. So I'm going to run a minimal Nginx image there as well. It's running, and then I'll do the same thing. I'll pick debug, a runtime, Podman, and then let's see debug images. So this is an example there. It's close enough. So there's a list of different images, and there's a couple of Chainguard images. There's a base Wolfie image that you can use, and there's also a dedicated MinToolkit debug image that they were nice enough to create. So Dan was really nice and responsive. I asked him, is it possible? And he said, yeah, sure. And the guys came up with that image in no time. So Chainguard is awesome. And then there are more traditional images like BusyBox, and then NetShoot, and a number of KoolKits images, though some of them are slightly out of date. That's why there's the MinToolkit version of the Golang KoolKit container image. So it has the newest Delve debugger in it. So it's also a matter of maintaining those tools, and that'll be one of the things that will happen with the debug command as well. So the main idea there is that you have a list of these different debug images that you don't need to look around. You can just pick one of them and that's it. So if you look at the BusyBox image, and maybe we'll do a demo for that as well, it's pinned to a specific digest. And it's interesting because the latest version of BusyBox is different from what it used to be. It used to be all static. So this is one of the other finer points of debug images, where ideally you need statically compiled binaries, because you're moving those binaries, exposing those binaries to a different context, to a different environment. And doing those symlinks works for the binary itself. But if it loads shared libraries dynamically, then you might have problems depending on the runtime you have in the target container image. If the target container image runtime, meaning the CLib versions, etc., are close enough to the runtime versions of your debug image, then you won't have a problem. But it's not always the case, especially if you're using, an Alpine image, a classic Alpine with muzzle in it, and your debug image is a traditional glib-based image. Some of those libraries might not be there. So when you have binaries that load shared libraries dynamically, you can have problems. And that's what It looks like that's the case with BusyBox now. Now it's not fully static. Now it loads clib dynamically. And you can actually, you can solve this, and Nix has a solution. I don't know if you explored it, but Nix is at a high level. If you use a couple of constructs there, it's a bunch of directories and symlinks. So at runtime, it symlinks to the right directory for you. That includes the right version of the binary and the library. And then it configures the path directory, path environmental variable. So the right thing gets picked up. And then something similar for shared libraries. Unfortunately, with shared libraries, it's a little more complicated. So there's an environmental variable there that you need to configure dynamically for each executable. And Nix does all that behind the scene because, again, it deals with those dynamically loaded shared libraries. So for those kind of debug images, that's exactly what will need to happen. And there's an experimental version of it in Mint, but it's not fully baked yet. So it was an unexpected surprise for me when I was trying to use the latest version, BusyBox, and it failed. I was like, what happened? Why is it telling me that it can't find glib? Because it's supposed to be static. And it turned out that it's no longer static. That's why this BusyBox image is pinned to a specific digest that's still static to simplify things. So I can pick any images, but by default, it picks the BusyBox. So target, Nginx. Well, how about debug image? And I don't need to use any of those images. I can just say BusyBox latest.
Oh yeah, you can. So you can use a standard nomenclature for finding an image somewhere on the internet. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And then later on, there will be a way to autocomplete based on the public registries as well. It's a nice enhancement that if anybody wants to contribute, that'll be a nice contribution. That's the awesome part about open source. You can contribute. So, okay, we have the debug image, target, and we'll pick the Nginx image there. Right there, if I do PS, I get this. And that's exactly what I was talking about. And if I exit, I do debug, runtime, Podman, target, same target, and I'm going to use the pinned BusyBox.
Oh, okay.
Not a problem anymore.
Yeah. So this is one of those things where, like, for a lot of people, especially if they're junior people learning containers and for the first time, and they're maybe not super fluent on Linux and how libraries are called, that this could be like a blocker, right? Like, this is back when you go back to Google and you're searching, like, what does this even mean? And traditionally, like, this was rarely ever seen unless you had a screwed up system, because we were all so used to fat servers, and we were all so used to everything's on this server. All the libraries I need are already here. The distribution, Ubuntu, CentOS, whatever, managed most of that for me. And I just use their package manager to install stuff. And it's one of those things where we have this history, and I've had rants on this show, or a soapbox moment that I won't get into today. But the summary of all that is, like, a lot of system design changes that are seemingly difficult to deal with in containers were all things we made decisions 20, 30, 40, sometimes even 50 years ago. And we had different problems then. And I get to this whole rant around new languages versus old languages, and why I poo-poo a bunch of old languages, just because they were solving problems in the 90s that we no longer really have. We have new and different problems now, and their architecture and opinions all affect that. So this is actually a really good demo, even for those that didn't get to see this because they're maybe listening to the podcast, where we're showing how if you have the concept of not a statically compiled binary, you might have library problems, and you might have, if things were compiled differently, you might have problems in your container where you're trying to do something with, a glib binary in a container that's running MuSil or vice versa or something like that. These are things that I pretend to understand. So I talk about them a lot in my courses even, but I'm not really studying like how these libraries are calling each other. So even I learned from you, I think it was in your talk, like the LD and some of the environment variables and things like that are managed in your shell by applications. And I learned a lot. So I'm going to recommend again to everyone, if they're really into this stuff and they want to understand more of the debug, just look up, just watch all the videos that say KyleQuest KubeCon on YouTube, and you'll be there for hours, but you'll learn a lot of stuff because this stuff can go pretty deep pretty quick. But I like how you're making it, especially you're really showing off the UI here of being in the interactive shell, how it solves a lot of these problems for you on not knowing. If you don't know a debug image you need to use, just try one. If that didn't work, try the other one, and it's going to pop up a list for you. Yeah, so it's pretty neat. I like
exactly. Exactly. And that's the whole point. And that's the intent behind the next generation of the interface, the AI-based interface, where it's even more user-friendly and you can interact with it in a more sophisticated way, as in not restricted to, a specific flow. So let's take a look at one of the Kubernetes examples. And I have several flavors there. And this one is interesting. I have a manifest with the Chainguard Images and Nix image. It's a minimal container image. It doesn't have a shell. And one of the things that we have here is the security spec. So if you have the security spec that says run as non-root, you'll have to deal with extra gotchas. And it's yet another example of having to know low-level details, especially when it comes to debugging, because now if you're using that netshoot container image or some other container image that happens to run as root by default, if you use kubectl debug, you'll get a cryptic error and you won't know what's going on. So unlike that flow, let's see, well, kubectl apply f. Okay, kubectl get pods. All right, starting up. It's up, and we can curl. Well, we can get in. I'm pretty sure we can get in. And let's do the same thing. We'll debug. We'll pick the runtime, Kubernetes, and with the Kubernetes runtime, you get auto completion for the namespace. I can pick default and all, but I don't even need to pick the default if that's where I'm running. So it'll pick the default namespace by default. Then you can pick the pod that you want to work with. And again, I don't have to pick it if I only have one pod. So I'm not even going to do it. And then I'm going to pick the target and right there. And technically, well, maybe I don't even need to pick the target there. I think there's a nice default there as well, but I'll pick it anyways. So right there, that's all I selected. And I have this special Kubernetes manifest with run as non-root in it, and I'm not doing anything extra. So hopefully it works. The last time it did. So now it's starting an ephemeral container. That's what we're waiting for.
So you're taking advantage of that. Well, maybe not a brand new feature, but a relatively new feature of ephemeral containers.
Okay. So yes. So right there, PS, and note the shell prompt. It's not the usual root prompt. It's a regular user prompt. Who am I? I'm actually user 65532 and cat etc pass w. D. I think that's where it is. Yep. That's where it is. Because it's not. So what happened? What are we looking at? We're actually looking at the password file for the debug image. How come we're not looking at the target environment? So here's what happened. The pod manifest has the run as non-root flag set. And because of that, you can't change root in the target environment file system. And the debug command detects that dynamically, that it can change root. So it's not doing that. And because of that, so you're not looking at the target file system, but you can still get to it the old fashioned way, which is proc1 root. And that's actually cat proc1 root, etc. pass wd. And that's where we're going to get the Nginx user. And that's 65532, the user I'm running as. Nice. So transparently, you can set the user ID and the group ID explicitly with command line parameters, and you can pick them dynamically in the interactive prompt mode as well. Not the values, but the flags themselves. But there's a nice flow there where it tries to figure out the user ID it should use if it's configured to run as non-root, and if the image doesn't use root as the user. So that's what happened internally. So you have access, you don't have as many nice things, but at least you are able to access the target environment.
Yeah, it's actually a really great demo, because this is another stumbling block that you're pointing out, where everything might work locally on Docker, but then they use a pod spec that essentially is going to further limit what they're doing, what it's running and doing in Kubernetes. And now suddenly they have this whole new set of problems that they don't have locally, and they maybe don't have the tools or depth of knowledge to figure this all out. I mean, I probably would spend hours trying to figure out my first couple of times, like how do I get into this thing, and how do I see the file system, and where do I find my process list, and that kind of thing. I just want to mention for people, if you're curious about that pod spec stuff, specifically like the things where you run not as root and you want to tighten up your own Kubernetes, which I highly recommend. Like, you probably should be doing all this stuff, but again, like Kyle's pointing out, a lot of times it's a barrier, and so we're going to get more into that in a minute. But I have a pod spec demo. I've mentioned it very often on the show. This is basically my recommended pod spec, and it lights up all those security features. So it's turning on seccomp. It's forcing the user in group. It's setting the running as non-root. It's preventing privilege escalation. And these are all things that just I look at this as like it's a pendulum of security and convenience. We're always managing that security and convenience pendulum. And this is taking it hard to the security side, which will then make everything harder to troubleshoot unless you're using Kyle's tools. But this is one of those things where I would try to implement this with teams as the DevOps guy, and we would have challenges with the developers just because they always assume they had root, or because it's maybe an old app that they always had root on servers when they built them, because maybe they needed to run on port 80. So they just assumed they had root, right? And so it becomes this whole project just to enable like one security feature in a Kubernetes pod spec, because you need to educate all the developers, you need to help them with the testing tools, debug tools. So I'm a fan of the fact that you're solving yet another challenging problem. You talk about this again back on the YouTube video. You talk about that in the slides. I actually think I had the slide pulled up here on this. So I have like the gotchas around changing the root file path, having, being the same user and group ID as the user in the pod or in that container on the pod. And these are all things that I feel like are definitely way more than day one Kubernetes learning. So those of you, if you're watching and you're going through my courses, which we get a lot of people watching from those, don't feel like this is all something you need to know. I didn't know this for the year one. Like I know this stuff I've struggled with for many years before I think I feel like feeling comfortable with it. And
it has many layers. Yeah. And it's okay not to get to everything right away.
Yeah. Cool. All right, back to the demo.
Yep. And then we have additional helper flags. For example, there's this mount target volumes flag or load target and vars flag. And what does it mean? So those are nice kind of UX enhancements where you can reload the environmental variables from the target container into the debug container when you're running, because normally they're not available. You can mount the volumes, target environment volumes, and that's more relevant when you're not running as root, because otherwise, you won't have access to them. And at least historically, kube control debug wouldn't allow you to do that. So you wouldn't be able to mount volumes. It wasn't a part of the features that they supported, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the general idea there to simplify the user experience. There's a flag to use the whole security context from the target. And the behavior that I described, this is controlled by figuring out the user ID is controlled by this flag, fallback to target user flag. It's on by default, but you can disable it. And this is one of the things I can potentially ask the AI to describe. So again, it's nice to have an assistant to help you.
Yeah, you're really saying that you're really driving this AI thing home, and I'm kind of getting it now, because a lot of these flags hide the complexity. It's kind of like when you first learn Docker, and I think I counted last time, there's like 80 flags for Docker run, option flags. And so you don't know those all 80 in day one, week one, month one, probably not even year one. And there's not you can't always describe why this has to exist and when you should use it in one line in the -- help output, right? So then you're forced to go find docs, and then the docs may only show you the help output. So it can always be, I think, struggling especially when you're talking about this complex Linux. Really, we're just talking about Linux shell and Linux kernel functionality that so many people in developer land, ops land, especially, but in developer land, they just don't have to know until now. Like they just could have avoided all that. And you're right in choosing these by default, because most people that are going to try to use a minimal image, I'm assuming that team is also going to be doing things like not running as root and turning on all these or limiting all these privileges in Kubernetes. If not mandated by their security team, they're probably already going to be doing all that stuff. So it's cool that you're solving some of these problems one by one and having the defaults here. So
one of the gotchas with the flag auto completion is that you still need to know the flag prefix in order to get more information about the flag. And with the AI interface, you can ask something a little more fuzzy. You don't need to enter the flag name and you'll get the information you need.
Like, how do I get environment variables into my shell in Kubernetes?
So I need this and this and that. And it'll tell you what parameters to use and all. So that's kind of the next level of user experience there, because it's an improvement, and the terminal UI interface will be improvement as well. But still, you don't always know where to look. You don't always know the name of it or the prefix and all. And it's great to have a more open-ended way to get what you need. So, and that's the intent. And like I said, this functionality will be built in. And there's a number of Kubernetes tools that try to be that assistant / debugger / explainer kind of thing. And those tools are built, a lot of them are actually built with Go. For example, Kate's GPT, that's built with Go. So overall, it looks doable. We'll have a POC there as well. And the model that they use to hook up the API key makes sense as well, because if it's in the CLI, I won't be paying for it. That's going to be super expensive to pay for everybody to use.
Not everybody can provide unlimited AI access for CLI tools. Hey, real quick, before we go further, you mentioned earlier KoolKits. I had not heard of KoolKits. I had to go look it up. So if those are others that are learning about this for the first time for me, what's the elevator pitch on this? This is actually sounds like a pretty cool project.
Yeah, so it's a side project from this startup that they created to debug different application runtimes, and they have dedicated images for different types of runtimes, for Node.js, for Go, for Java, for Python, and they're designed with a specific set of tools that match that runtime. For example, for the Go debug image, they have the Delve debugger in it. And obviously for the JVM image, they have the appropriate Java debugging tools and all of that, obviously the GRE, et cetera, et cetera. So the only gotcha there is that they're slightly out of date. That's what I discovered with, actually, it wasn't me. It was a user who discovered that the Delve debugger in the Go image was older and it had bugs. So that's why I ended up creating a new one. But the intent is great. You have dedicated debug toolkits for different runtimes with the right tools for that specific runtime. Because otherwise, you need to have everything, and you don't always have everything, because usually with microservices, you have a Java microservice,
right?
Or you have a Node microservice or a Python microservice or whatever AI app you have. So it makes sense to have these stack specific debug images, and that's what they do. And there's NetShoot that's network centric and not specific for a particular application stack, but it is for network troubleshooting. And so different goals for different image, slightly out of date. The product was also pretty interesting because they have a kind of a more advanced platform to interact with your applications in the production environment.
Oh,
so
Lightrun?
Kind of their open source Lightrun. That's their commercial product.
And for those listening, KoolKits is with K's, as all Kubernetes tools require.
Exactly.
So KoolKits. And so you can check those out. NetShoot, if you just look up, I actually have my own variant of that image because I use it in the courses and in my demos a lot. NetShoot, if you just look up NetShoot one word on GitHub, you'll find Nikolai's option there, which that's been around, forever. That was probably like pre-Kubernetes, I think. That image has been around since he was working at Docker.
That's probably the most known debug image that's out there, and the first one that I knew about.
And nobody wants a 10 gig image to download on their servers to debug. So it's appropriate that we end up with all these options that you're showing, because those, if you start adding everything, you end up with, 10, easily 10 gig, especially if you're talking about multiple language and framework debuggers like that. Those tend to be not small.
And when you have minimal container images, you can bring in the stuff that you need on demand. That's the nice thing about it. And here's another example of using the AI assistant where I asked about that run as target shell flag, and kind of it gives me an overview about what it is and why, without needing to navigate through the proc file system, etc. So that's the goal, kind of the next frontier in terms of the user interface for.
Well, this seems to be very useful. Obviously, it's not like when we talk a lot about these debug utilities, especially in open source, like it's not debugging for you. It's maybe something we should have talked about at the beginning, but for those that are new, like this is not something that's going to automatically tell you what's wrong with your app or why your container is misbehaving. That's probably a commercial product that is much more advanced.
Exactly. There are a number of companies designed specifically for that, and there'll be a lot more because of LLMs and all.
But we all kind of need to start somewhere, I feel like, and not everyone can justify or afford big tools like that, just like we can't all always afford profilers or not profilers, but the observability tool that you plug in, APMs and stuff like that maybe bigger companies and enterprises can use. But I have a lot of what I call the solo DevOps crew in my community, where it's one person that's kind of saddled with all of this work of just managing CI, managing infrastructure, managing servers and Kubernetes, and just it goes on and on and on. And so I'm always considering, like, how hard is this for a new person to pick up, and what actual skills do they need to know before they learn this? Because obviously you need to be at some level of developer, depending, I guess, when you're troubleshooting in your container. Maybe you're just troubleshooting, does it even have network connectivity? I don't know. So maybe you don't need to be a full-on developer to do that, which we also have a lot of people that are not full-time developers. They're just operations people, sysadmins that maybe don't program for a living. So they're looking for tools that aren't so programmer specific. And so that's like the NetShoot utility from the container image for NetShoot. That's got a ton of just standard Linux utilities in cat, stuff like that you can use in an image or use in a container rather. So.
And just to reiterate, the intent behind the debug command and the user experience there is to get you to the same user experience you have with the regular container images, as if you still had the fat images and you still have all of your tools in the shell in one place. It doesn't try to debug for you. So that's not in scope. Yeah. That's not the intent. You still need to know how to use the tools. You still need to know the right commands, debug commands. And like you said, there is an opportunity to have higher level tools, and a lot of them will be commercial tools, but I'm pretty sure some of them will be open source. Even Kate's GPT is sort of in that space where they analyze different parts of the Kubernetes environment, and then they try to make sense of the event logs and the error logs and all of that. They try to troubleshoot things for you. So there is something in the open source community, and there will be more, and LLMs will be used more for that.
We've had a lot of those commercial troubleshooting in those kind of tools. Essentially, we've had those on the show for years. So if you're like, what are all those tools? Well, I don't have all of them, but I have a lot of videos on YouTube. So go back in the channel, look at the guests. We have a lot of Kubernetes. It feels like observability. We even just had one on this month. Observability, troubleshooting, monitoring, all those things. There's a whole ecosystem of tooling out there that's probably going to solve some of these problems for you, but it's nice. This is a pretty cool thing. And like you said, this is not Kubernetes specific. A lot of these things can be used across at least 3, if not 4 different runtimes. You can use it locally. You can use it remotely. We didn't even really go into like how it's connecting to the different servers, but I'm sure that you could just ask the AI that. We don't have to teach you everything about this tool.
So the debug command is awesome, and it's a part of the toolkit. That's the whole point of the name, MinToolkit, because it's more than just slimming, more than just debugging, more than just X-raying. It's a lot of different things. Ultimately, the goal there is to be the CLI and the app for all things containers, longer term goal. So that's what I want to use all the time. And as I add things, that's the intent, longer term intent for me, to use this as one tool as opposed to a bunch of different tools, regardless of runtime and all. And because multiple runtimes will be the norm, going forward. And just with Docker and Kubernetes alone, you have that, and having that CLI that helps me interact with containers regardless of where they are, the environment and the runtime. That's kind of that's the intent behind the open source tool. If you want a dedicated debugging tool for containers, I want to make sure I mention cdebug. Cdebug is something that Ivan Velichko created, and it's mentioned in that presentation, KubeCon presentation. He was supposed to be there, but because of the family reasons, he couldn't make it. He has awesome blogs and a set of labs, container, Kubernetes, and Docker and Linux learning labs that, if you want to know more, you can look at those and explore those. And he has the dedicated debug tool as well. The Podman support isn't quite there. The design is slightly different, but it's dedicated to container debugging specifically. So there's a lot of overlap, slightly different design and slightly different coverage in terms of the capabilities and the runtimes. But I want to make sure that's also available for everybody in their tool chain. You pick the tools that make sense, easier to use, and it's always good to have more options because they may fit your flow and your use cases better. That's the labs. And then you can go to the GitHub project, cdebug. So if you look for cdebug on GitHub, you'll be able to find it.
CD, as it sounds, cdebug?
C as in container. So container debug, but C.
Got it. Wow. Yep. Okay, here we go.
That's an awesome option as well.
Yeah, very cool. I didn't know about this. What we were talking about the other week, I use stars on GitHub to know when I've actually seen something. I don't actually use it for if I like it or I've used it. I'm just like, okay, I've been here. I've marked my spot so that when I come back and I'm like, I don't remember this. Well, I've been here before. Weird habit, but it's what I do. This is really cool. I'm actually going to check this out.
Give it a try. And again, it's dedicated to debugging. It has other nice capabilities with port forwarding, which is its own thing with some of the runtimes. And in some runtimes, it's trickier to do than in others and all. And
yeah, really cool. I know we're running long, but I felt like I knew it was going to be long because I wanted to get some demos in. I wanted to get some people hands-on understanding of this debug can be complex, but that your tool really does solve some of those complexity problems for people so they don't have to think about it. I always felt like I had to have my own kit, and it would mean I had to have a bunch of notes about all these esoteric options I might have to use in kube control debug, or I had all these notes about how to use NSEnter, and I feel like I can kind of get rid of a lot of that and just use the debug command, which I haven't really used in a real production setup yet. So I was excited to learn more, and you've mentioned it several times. I'm like, I know I need to spend some time on learning that.
Yeah, there will be some advanced cases where you might still need to use NSEnter when you need to accomplish certain things, low-level things at the node level in Kubernetes and all of that. I'm not saying that it's going to cover 100%
it's not
use cases.
Right. Good point.
But it's not meant to be. It's meant to cover kind of the 80-20 kind of thing. Make it easy 80% of the time, because that's the whole point. Just because of the tricky 20% or 10%, your whole developer experience doesn't need to suffer. And NSEnter shouldn't have to be the tool to use to do all of those things.
And to remind people, this is also very much, like we said earlier, very much why a lot of people try to go down that security, they go hard into the security. This is sort of if I can look at some of my past clients, and the tendency that they have is they get one engineer that gets really focused on security or excited about it with Docker and Kubernetes, and they keep learning more things that they can lock down and enable, and they learn about AppArmor and SE Linux and SecComp, and they get super nerdy on this stuff, which is good. I super encourage that, and I do that same thing myself. But then they hit reality hits when they go to production, and they're the only person that knows all this stuff, and now no one else can actually help. And I've seen it happen, and then they end up having to back off, and maybe using back when we were all using the distroless images from Google, and you would have to put the dev in the tag because you needed the shell, and you could never get to the true distro list because people demanded it or expected a package manager and expected a shell in there. And I've watched people sort of feel like they lost sort of an honorable fight by trying to implement tighter security because they didn't really know how to give everyone the right tools. And so I feel like this is one of those things where we can sort of shout from the rooftops of like, hey, you want to do all that? You better know some of these tools. Like maybe you got a Docker debug command because you pay for Docker and you can use that. I have heard, I'm not sure if it's rumor or if they've even done it, but I have heard that they were going to add Kubernetes to it. I'm not sure if that's actually out yet, but they were going to.
I've heard about it as well, that they're working on it. I thought it was a beta feature.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't. Yeah. I tried it. I played with it this week and I couldn't see how to do Kubernetes in like the default built-in version. Yeah. So I'm going to there's actually a Docker Captain Summit. So I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot of things, some things I can't say, and then a lot of things that are going to be about like what they're doing with Docker Desktop and some of the stuff that they're adding to Hub and Desktop and just adding, I feel like Docker's on this tear of just adding a whole bunch of extra functionality around containers that's related. So
one of the big challenges in general, you mentioned those engineers who get very excited by the advanced features, is that they're niche and advanced, and your average developer, the masses, don't necessarily know them and don't necessarily have an experience dealing with them. That's one of the gotchas. Now you're expecting others to be at the same level as you in terms of the expertise, and it's just not great. So yes, it's possible. Yes, it's there, but it shouldn't have to be the default for the average developer. So you need to find a way to make it work for the average developer. Otherwise, it's not going to be practical. So, that's kind of the key idea behind this concept with DockerSlim debug. Make it approachable and usable by the average developer. Make it accessible to the masses. Not necessarily there isn't a better way to do it, a more advanced way to do it, but it is an easy way to do the most common things that you're used to.
Yeah. This has been awesome. I mean, I feel like we could do this for another 3 hours, but we both probably need a refill on a drink or a bio break or something like that. Yep. So thanks so much, Kyle, for being here. This was a lot of fun. So in case you didn't, if you want to follow Kyle, what's your Twitter handle? I forgot. Or your X handle, I guess?
KCQ on.
KCQ on. So for these who want to follow him, he's pretty active on Twitter. I see you talking with Dagger people and other community members.
If anybody is interested in doing a session on kind of exploring the AI tools in the DevOps space, we can do a kind of a design review of the different tools to kind of look at the magic inside, including K8s, GPT, etc. So what's the magic? How does it work? What does it do? There's a number of nice tools, and I think it can be helpful, but I'm up for doing something like that and talk about agents, etc. later on. So just a thought.
Yeah, I find Kyle very approachable. Like I'm not going to promise for you, but he will probably reply to you on Twitter if you reach out to him. Especially if you're looking to help with the project. You also have a Discord server, right? Like you have Discord, there's the discussions on GitHub. Like if you're interested in these tools, there's lots of places that Kyle's provided to the community to go find that stuff. And I'm looking forward to hearing on the updates. So Kyle's giving you like half a dozen reasons to go help out with the community around Mint.
Lots of new features on the wish list.
Yeah.
And if you want to contribute, that would be great. We got a couple of contributors in the latest release. It's good to see more.
Yeah. Where's the wish list? Is it on the README, or do you use like GitHub projects for that? Or
it's a combination. There's a roadmap MD file. There is a set of GitHub issues, and there's just stuff that's floating around.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, we're going to do this again, soon, whenever that is. So please stay tuned. Come back on Thursdays. Listen to the podcast. We'll see you soon, everybody. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.